Welcome to Religion, Sex, and Politics, your place to talk about the three things we're not supposed to talk about. If you haven't already, subscribe and ring the bell. And if you like our content, help out the channel by sharing this video with others. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Religion, Sex, and Politics. I'm Andrew Lynch, and I'm looking forward to looking at the war in Ukraine with you here in this next video. If you've been paying attention to the news, you've probably heard a sort of singular narrative, and from the perspective of the United States and from Western Europe, they've framed this entire war in terms of ideology. But I would remind you of a great thinker named Samuel Huntington, who back in 1996 presented us with a book called The Clash of Civilizations. And I would like to present to you in this video an idea of the Ukrainian war in terms of this civilizational conflict. Now, in terms of Russia versus what we could call the West, or what I like to call the Atheist West, there's certainly a clash of civilizations here that Huntington would talk about. But at the same time, we could look at what's going on in Ukraine and between Ukraine and Russia. If we understand the history of the Slavic people, we see that this is almost a kind of civil war between members of a common ethnic heritage and a common religious heritage. And so what the media won't tell us is, or won't help us understand, and maybe it's just because it would take too much time, the media doesn't help us understand the history and the geography, and of course the religion behind what is going on in Ukraine right now. And since you're here with me for this live stream, I'd like to kind of take you through some of that. So we're going to be looking at a decent bit of maps in this presentation. We're going to be looking at the history. In fact, our history is actually going to go all the way back to the 4th century AD. And as we kind of unpack the story of how we got to where we are today, it's a big story. There's a lot of things to cover. But not only am I going to give you the history and the culture and the religious dimension, all this, but I actually at the very end, I'd like to discuss briefly what are some potential things that could happen in the near future as we see a resurgent Orthodox Slavic Russia. I'm interested. It's certainly not a prediction by any means, and perhaps none of what I think could happen will happen. And but it's still interesting to think about once we place Russia and what Russia is doing within its historical and religious context, then we can kind of get an idea of what we could see in the months or years ahead. Now, before we dig in, I just would like to encourage all of you to, if you haven't already yet, to like this video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't. If you ring the bell, you'll be able to get alerted when I go live in the future, and for any other videos that I put out. I'm trying to make some more videos using this new format, this sort of layout that I have on the screen for you. And in doing so, I've been able to actually release some more videos than I would have otherwise been able to do. And in fact, I have another video in the editing process now that I hope to be able to have it live here in the next day or two. Now, I'd love to engage with you in the comment section. If you have any questions or comments, please leave that in the comment section below. I'm able to watch here live for any questions or comments that come up. Really would love to get to engage with you in those. If you're watching this in the future, feel free to drop a comment, and I would love to discuss the topic with you at a later date. Other than that, we're going to go ahead and dig in, and I'm going to actually lay some maps out for us at first to sort of lay the groundwork for some of the history that we're going to be taking a look at here. All right, the first map I'd like to show you is the World Civilizations map, according to Samuel Huntington, which he made back in 1996. And maybe the first thing I might point out here is that we've got these different color-coded sections. And his color coding is to show us the different civilizations of the world. And remember, this is back in 1996. Back in the 1990s, following the defeat of the Soviet Union in the Cold War, we saw an America and its allies in Western Europe sort of dominate the globe, and we called this the unipolar moment. This idea that the United States emerged from the Cold War as the last remaining superpower, and it spent the 1990s in a position that it could shape the global order as it saw fit. And essentially, this unipolar moment begins to ebb and wane here as we move into the War on Terror in the early 2000s. And what we're seeing right now is a shakeup of that very unipolar world. That what we're seeing now is not that Russia is emerging as the superpower to vie against the United States, but rather we're seeing the emergence of many different, as Huntington would call, many different civilizations. And what we're entering into now is a return to a multipolar world, which is a world that we haven't seen really since before the World War, or rather since World War II or even before. So if you look at this map, you'll notice that it's color coded, and most of it is connected to religion, or certainly a great part of it. The green section that you see there in North Africa and across the Middle East, and then into Oceania off to the right of the screen, that is your Islamic civilization. The orange there in the Indian subcontinent is your Hindu civilization. The yellow that we see in Southeast Asia and in Tibet and in Mongolia is Buddhist civilization. The red is Confucian China and its civilization. We could talk about Japan there in pink as a Shinto civilization. And a great deal of the world would actually fall under what we would call Christian civilization. And up in that baby blue in the top right of the screen, where we see Russia, and we see other countries there within that, that are sharing that same blue color. And what we're seeing there is what Huntington would call Orthodox Christian civilization. And what I would argue is that it is a sub-civilization within the broader framework of what I would call Christian civilization. So speaking of Christian civilization, this is a map. If you took the world and you examined the countries that were Christian, and you wanted to analyze what we would call global Christianity, this is the map that you'd see. In theory, a Christian America, because the United States is, in the terms of population, the most populous Christian nation on earth. If the United States sought to form an alliance with other great Christian nations, well, we'd have the United States as the largest Protestant nation in the world. Brazil and Mexico are certainly two of the greatest, most populous Catholic nations in the world. And then, of course, Orthodox Russia being the largest Orthodox nation on the earth. And so, unfortunately, what we see is that America does not form alliances based off of its religious heritage, or if it does, it might base it more in terms of what we would call the old WASP aspect of the United States, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant United States, because when we look at the alliance that the United States is pursuing, first and foremost, we're seeing an emergence of an Anglo-American alliance, and that refers to the United States, Great Britain, and the former white dominions of the British Empire. But what I'd like to just get this in your head here is this picture of global civilization and the world that could form an incredible alliance, a deepening of the Christian bonds that are already there beneath the surface, that are binding upon the people who live in these various countries. But instead, what we're seeing is what I would call the Atheist West, seeking conflict with what should be an ally in Christian Russia. So let's take a look at the Atheist West, as I mentioned it. So the Atheist West is really the countries we see here in blue, which, as I mentioned, the Anglo-American alliance, the United States with Great Britain, and then its white dominions. For example, here we see Canada and we see Australia and New Zealand. But of course, we also see that a fairly substantial chunk of Western and Central Europe. And so this is our alliance structure. So if you were to label a map, if I gave you a blank map and asked you who are America's allies, you would probably circle these countries because this is the alliance structure that they talk to us about in the media, and they probably even teach us in schools, or we hear about in our conversation with friends and family. But I would like to stress that global Christianity opens up a much bigger map than what we see here, and like I call it, the Atheist West. And we'll talk about the rise of atheism a bit here in what is called Western civilization. Indeed, we'll see that in our battle with the Soviet Union and communism. Communism, where does it come from? It doesn't come from Russia. It comes from Germany, which is, if you look on the map here, colored in blue. So we'll talk more about that in a bit. But this is the alliance structure as most Americans, I believe, would see it, because they are looking at the map in terms of this atheistic, hegemonic, globalistic, national structure that really seeks to impose its views and its values on the rest of the world. And actually, what we're seeing right now is the hysteric overreaction by these particular countries regarding the current war in Ukraine is actually undermining their ability to influence the world, especially in terms of economics. And we're seeing that Russia is forming an even deeper alliance with China, that India is not going along with the sanctions efforts of the West, nor are countries like, I believe, Brazil and Mexico. Even Israel and Georgia are sitting this whole thing out. And really what we're seeing here is that the West is finding itself increasingly isolated as it attempts to punish Russia for the actions in Ukraine. So briefly, I just wanted to show you here that sort of zooming in on the Orthodox Russian civilization according to Samuel Huntington. I don't fully agree with everything that he has depicted here on this map. Of course, it was a sort of a single color map, so a little bit difficult to try to be more nuanced given the color coding here. For example, you will see Kazakhstan is the very large country, sort of just underneath Russia, also sharing the same color as Russia. But Kazakhstan is actually 3/4 Muslim and only 1/4 Christian. So I don't see Kazakhstan necessarily being part of this Orthodox Russian civilization. But we're actually going to take a look at the map of Russia as it was in 1914, just before it entered into the First World War. And we'll see that perhaps part of Russia's ambitions could very well be not the restoration of the Soviet Union, but rather of the restoration of perhaps some of its borders that go back to the year 1914. In Southeast Europe, an area that we call the Balkans, you can kind of get an idea of which countries would find themselves within the Orthodox world and which countries are in the Islamic world, and which countries we would see as more historically Catholic countries. So we'll take a closer look at these countries here shortly, but I just want to sort of throw this map out there so you can start to see where the traditional lines of the Orthodox civilization can be found, and what countries, generally speaking, would belong to that Orthodox civilization. All right, so we're going to go back in time. We're going to go back to the 4th century. And in this period, this is going to sort of lay the foundation for what we'll see with the emergence of Russia as we see it today. So my first little section here is about Christianity and the Slavs. And the first thing to do is as we pick up in the 4th century, and we could even talk about the 3rd century of the Roman Empire, there was a period in the Roman Empire called the 3rd century crisis. And what took place was a series of leaders killing off the next to become the Roman emperor. And we saw a period of many, many civil wars and emperors being killed left and right. The leader that brought Rome out of this 3rd century crisis was a man named Diocletian, who was a severe persecutor of Christianity. And his solution to the infighting was essentially to divide the empire, and it divided it into two main parts, with each of the two halves having its own two-part structure. We're not going to get too much into the details of the tetrarchy of Diocletian in this video, but what I do want to sort of paint a picture here for you is that we see a map here on the screen. We see a sort of reddish color of the Western Roman Empire and that purpley color of the Eastern Roman Empire. In the year 313, we see the current, or actually at the time, the man who was fighting his way to become the sole emperor of the Roman Empire, a man named Constantine. Well, he's going to have a vision that will lead him to legalize Christianity in the Roman Empire. This is certainly a stark contrast to just a few years before what we saw with Diocletian. But Constantine, with the Edict of Milan, legalizes Christianity. And just a few decades later, we see Emperor Theodosius issuing the Edict of Thessalonica, which makes Christianity the official religion of the empire. Skipping just down to the bottom for just a second, one of the things that Constantine would do is he will center the empire really in a new capital in the east called, at the time he called it Novus Roma, or New Rome. Also could be called the Second Rome, but the people, since Constantine created it, they generally like to call it Constantinople, or the city of Constantine. And with this new capital in the east, we're seeing a shifting away of power from Rome in what is today Italy over to this new city, Constantinople. Now, Christianity at the time, I'd just like to stress that there is a single Christian church in the 4th century, but it is nevertheless a really very diverse church. And what I mean by that is that there was unity in the essentials and in the core teachings of the faith. There's a controversy throughout the 4th century called Arianism, which is a debate over the Trinity and the full divinity of Christ. But through this period, we see that despite the theological arguments, we do see an orthodoxy that emerges that binds all Christians within the Roman Empire and even in spaces beyond the Roman Empire. But what we see as far as diversity goes is that in different parts of the empire, we see different languages and different cultural practices being incorporated into what is called the Christian liturgy. Catholics might call it the Mass. This is how Christians worship God, and also how they celebrate special rites called sacraments in the Western Church, and sometimes known as mysteries in the Eastern Church. And so in the various parts of the empire, in the West, we see the dominance of the Latin aspect of the church. So this would be where you'd find the Pope and you would go to Mass and it would be in Latin. Whereas in the East, Greek certainly dominated, but Greek wasn't the only language used for Mass or the liturgy in the eastern half of the Roman Empire. You would also find the Mass or the liturgy being spoken in Syriac or Aramaic and Coptic if you live down in what is today Egypt. And so there was this great diversity within the church. And in fact, that diversity still exists. But for most people, at least in the Catholic world, we generally think of the Latin church under the Pope. And currently the Pope today is Pope Francis. But even within the Catholic Church, there are these other these other groupings for the liturgical diversity within the church. For example, if you went to Lebanon, and you went to Mass in Lebanon, you would go to Mass and hear the language that Jesus would have spoken, that Aramaic language. And so all these different places had these different practices and different languages where the core components of the liturgy were the same no matter where one went. And what we're going to be seeing here is that this East-West division within the Roman Empire is going to give rise to a bigger East-West divide that in some ways we still see here today when we talk about the current conflict with Western Europe and Russia. So just to zoom in here a little bit, this is that same map I just spoke of. Constantine, I mentioned, created that new capital of Constantinople, originally called Novus Roma or New Rome. And I want to sort of explain why this is such an important location for the capital in the East. It's actually located in a kind of crossroads. Any ocean-going trade between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea would have to pass directly by Constantinople through what are today called the Turkish Straits. I believe that Constantinople is actually found on a particular strait called the Bosphorus. But it wasn't just about sea trade. Constantinople would also be on the trade route going east-west between Asia and Europe. And I have a couple sub-maps here. You can see that the map at the very top right zooms us in just a little bit. And you can see where Constantinople is labeled there. There's this little red there around it where you can see the seaway passage between the Black Sea into what's known as the Sea of Marmara, which then goes through the Dardanelles into the Aegean Sea. And if you go south through the Aegean Sea, you'll reach the Mediterranean. And if you zoom in even more, you can see again, we have Europe and Asia to the right, or Asia to the right, Europe to the left. And that little red blob there, that is the original city of Constantinople. And you'll notice if we zoomed in even further that it is surrounded by sea or by water to the south, to the east, and to the north. To the west, it was open, but Constantinople would build some of the biggest walls in the world to protect it from any invasion. So it was a strategically important, or rather a strategically secure location for a capital, while also being a very important place for trade. And the eastern half of the Roman Empire was always much wealthier than the western half. And indeed, we're going to see that the eastern half of the Roman Empire actually survives much, much longer than the western half. And of course, here's another little zoom in here to on the left side of your screen. I have red arrows and yellow arrows to give you an idea of kind of what these walls look like that were on the west side of the city. Constantinople was attacked many, many times in history, and these walls, along with a healthy dose of prayer, kept the city going for centuries. Now, in the bottom right-hand corner, we see an image of the famed Hagia Sophia church, which was really the greatest church of the time, and an architectural marvel. If you can see the dome at the top, there were windows at the base that if you went into the church and you looked up at a certain angle, a certain time of day, the light would come through the windows, and it would almost appear as though, with this light shining in, it would appear as though the dome was floating on air. If I recall, engineers today still aren't quite sure how this thing was built. It was certainly, as I say, an architectural marvel, and it is the jewel of the Orthodox world. It is no longer a church of worship for the Orthodox Church. And if you see it today, there are 4 minarets, towers surrounding it, because this has been held and taken over by the Islamic conquerors in the 15th century, which we'll get to in just a minute. All right, so I mentioned here that there's going to be a division within the empire, that the Western Empire doesn't last as long as the Eastern Empire. And the reason for that is that we have these Germanic barbarian invaders that sweep into Western Europe. And these barbarians move in during the 5th century. And in the year 476, we hear this is the traditional dating of what's called the fall of Rome. And for many of us, we tend to think that the whole Roman Empire collapsed in the year 476. But that's not quite true. The western half of the empire begins to break apart as these Germanic peoples establish their own kingdoms in Western Europe, but the eastern half of the Roman Empire continues. Now, historians like to call this eastern half of the empire the Byzantine Empire, and in some sense, it's just to help us distinguish a sort of a new phase in the life of the Roman Empire. If you went back in time and you went to Constantinople in, say, the year 600, and you asked them what the name of their empire was, they would tell you it's the Roman Empire. But historians would note some differences that we see here with this shift to the east. Well, first of all, we're no longer in Rome anymore. We're in Constantinople. So Constantinople was built on the plains of Byzantium, so they like to call this the Byzantine Empire. We also see that this is a Greek-speaking empire, not a Latin-speaking empire, as we saw with the Western Roman Empire. And also, this empire is decidedly Christian. It is not pagan. So when we look back at the early days of the Roman Empire, it's certainly a pagan empire, and it certainly persecuted Christianity for some centuries before it was legalized. So historians call this the Byzantine Empire, but the people of the time would certainly call themselves the Roman Empire. Now, in the West, we're going to be seeing the role of the popes and the Catholic Church converting these Germanic barbarians, and these barbarians would in turn create kingdoms that would develop into the nations of Western Europe, like France or England or even Germany. So that gives you sort of an idea of this East-West division. So let's take a quick look here at the leadership within the church. What we'll see is that in the West, the Pope plays an important role in baptizing the barbarians. The picture here on the left side of the screen is a picture of the baptism of Clovis, who was the leader of the Franks. and Clovis would be help in the spreading of Christianity amongst the Frankish people, and these people would emerge as the French. And so we see in here the baptism of a Frankish ruler who would then give rise not simply to a kingdom but to a nation. The last command of Jesus was to baptize the nations, and this is exactly what the Catholic Church in the West was doing during much of the early and high medieval period. Now, in the East, of course, the chief leader is the Patriarch of Constantinople. One of the things that would divide the East and the West in terms of Eastern Church and the Western Church, or we could say the Catholic Church in the West and the Orthodox churches in the East, one of the things that divide them is this whole idea of the papacy. Now, the argument that would be made by the Patriarch of Constantinople is that the leader of the church should be the bishop who is the bishop of the city where the capital of the empire is found. And so for a long time that was in Rome. So the papacy in Rome led the church. But now the new capital is in Constantinople, and therefore the Patriarch of Constantinople should be the leader of the church. Now, the counter argument to this has nothing to do with the imperial power or the imperial capital. The reason why the Pope is in Rome is because it is the city where St. Peter died and was bishop when he died. So because St. Peter was the leader of the church and he died in Rome as Bishop of Rome, then his successor in Rome would inherit his authority to govern the church and to shepherd the church until the good shepherd Christ himself returns at the end of time. And I think that's a very solid argument, but it is worth noting the two different arguments that would end up contributing to the division of the empire, or rather to the church within the empire, and beyond the realm of the empire in the old Western Roman Empire in the Great Schism of 1054. I'd also say that some of these roots are not simply theological. So we often say that, the East and West have these theological disagreements, but I tend to think that some of these disagreements are actually find their origins in cultural and political differences. So if you're the Byzantine Emperor and you look off to the West, there are all these barbarians overrunning everything, and it's really a backwater part of the world at this point. So why should we, if you're the emperor, why look to the Pope in Rome as some big important person, or look to anybody in the West as playing any crucial role in the world? This is a barbaric realm, and so the Easterners tended to emphasize the differences that they had with those who lived in the old Western Empire, and so these cultural and even political differences sort of weasel their way into theology, and then we see this strain within the church theologically that ends up leading to this great schism that unfortunately still remains to this day. And in the year 2054, we will see the 1,000-year anniversary of this first great split within the church, and it's certainly something I would love to see come to an end. However, the Ukrainian issue today is just one aspect of a larger religious division that we're actually going to see more of shortly. All right, so let's talk about the Slavic migrations. I mentioned how the Germanic peoples pushed into Western Europe, and the Germanic, these barbarian tribes, actually trace their origins back up in Scandinavia, in Norway and Sweden. They migrated down into Denmark and then into Germany, and then from there pushed into Western Europe. The Slavs are not coming from Scandinavia. They are coming from, arguably what is today the heartland of Russia, in the lands to the west of the Ural Mountains, and these Slavic peoples would migrate into Eastern Europe rather into Western Europe. And in fact, to some extent, the Slavs were a tricky issue for the Byzantine Empire, because you saw this great movement, this great migration of peoples into what was a historic important part of the Byzantine Empire in we would call it the Balkans today, southeastern Europe. But we could talk about the Slavs in three groups rather than just one monolithic Slavic group, and we can talk about them in terms of the the South Slavs, the East Slavs, and the West Slavs. And I'd like to just go ahead and point out to you kind of the differences or these groupings and who belong to them, and point out how they come to us today. All right, so the West Slavs, these would this is sort of the green section in that map that's on the screen. We see the Poles, the Czechs, and the Slovaks, and these Slavs would convert to Latin Christianity, which today would be Catholicism. So this is why if you go to Poland, it's a Catholic nation, but not just Poland. What became Czechoslovakia, and now we talk about the Czech Republic and Slovakia. These would be peoples who converted to Latin Christianity, like as I said, Catholicism today. Now in the East, what we see, interestingly enough, this is our blue section. This would comprise of modern day Russians, Belarusians, and Ukrainians. And of course, these Slavs would convert to a form of Greek Christianity, and eventually, of course, we see the Russian Orthodox Church today. So when we look at the conflict in Ukraine, we're seeing a kind of an alliance of Belarusians and Russians against their cousins, the Ukrainians. And what we'll see here too, and even deeper than this, we're going to see that the first major Slavic state, the Kyrian Rus, is going to be a union of these three lands, and that's where we really get the origins of the Russian state today. Now, down in the south, we have a bit of a trickier issue. So we have the South Slavs, and these we could talk in general terms as divided between the Croats and the Serbs. We're going to take a look at the map, a closer map of the region here in just a little bit. But what we'll see is that the Serbs are going to become Orthodox, while the Croats will be Catholic. So when we talk about Croatia and Slovenia, these are the Catholic countries of the South Slavs, while Serbia forms the core of the Orthodox amongst the South Slavs. Now, Slavs certainly also moved, as you see, down into Greece. And so Greece today has this your older Greek ethnic line, but you also see the introduction of the Slavic dimension into Greece that comes down to us to today. So for the most part, the Southern Slavs are going to embrace Orthodoxy and really have more of an eye towards the Byzantine Empire, until somebody called the Turks are going to show up, and that's going to complicate things still further. So as it is, the South Slavs are already a tricky situation because we have a division between Catholics and Orthodox, but soon we're going to see an introduction of Muslims into this as well, and that's why we've seen so many battles and wars break out in the Balkans, and of course politics as well as religion play a role in this as well. So one of the big efforts of both the Eastern Church and the Western Church was the conversion of the Slavs. And two great men, two brothers, who are most known as these apostles to the Slavs are the brothers Cyril and Methodius. In the Catholic tradition, their Memorial Day that we celebrate the memory of Cyril and Methodius is actually on February 14th, which most of us would think about St. Valentine's Day. But if you went to Mass on Valentine's Day, you'd actually hear about Cyril and Methodius. Now, they wanted to go and to convert the Slavs, and they ended up meeting with the Pope at the time, who is St. Nicholas the Great. He's one of the three popes that have that title, the Great, after his name. But he is perhaps the one great pope who most people don't know about. And it's certainly a shame, because what St. Nicholas did, what Pope Nicholas did, was he endorsed the efforts of Cyril Methodius, and he agreed to allow the creation of a liturgy in the language of the Slavs, in a Slavic tongue. And so today we do still see this sort of Slavic liturgy that comes down to us today, but traces its origins back to the efforts of Cyril and Methodius and Pope St. Nicholas the Great. But we also see that the Pope approves of the creation of a Slavic alphabet that could be used to translate the Bible and liturgical texts into the language of the Slavs for use in the liturgy and for, of course, reading Scripture. And so some people, even today, we talk about the Vatican, those who are opposed to Vatican II, saying that we have to have Mass in Latin. Mass must only be in Latin. And when we look back to St. Nicholas the Great, who actually called such an idea Pilatism, and the idea that Pontius Pilate put on the cross these three languages, Jesus Christ or Jesus King of the Jews, in Greek, Latin, and Hebrew. And so some people say those are the three sacred languages, and you cannot have the liturgy or the Mass in anything but those three languages. While St. Nicholas the Great called that Pilatism, that he fully approved of this idea of enculturation, that we could reach a people in their own language to spread the faith amongst them and to see them become Christian and make this great contribution to the Christian tradition, and to indeed global civilization, which is what we're going to see with the Russian civilization, the Orthodox Russian civilization. All right, so hopefully put that in your hat here. Pope St. Nicholas the Great, the greatest pope who most people don't know enough about. All right, so I just want to mention here this Kyrian Rus. This is our first great Slavic state, which is amongst the East Slavs. And what we'll see is that the Kyrian Rus would go on to incorporate what is today Russia, or at least the core of Russia in the east, or the Western Russia rather, and Belarus, and of course Ukraine. Now the saint associated here with this is Saint Vladimir, who was ruler of the Kyrian Rus, who converts to Christianity, is baptized, and begins the conversion efforts of the East Slavs. Again, this would include the Russians, Belarusians, and Ukrainians. And so for St. Vladimir, he sought to bring the Kyrian Rus, or even sometimes called Kyrian Russia, and bring that into an alliance with the Byzantine Empire. And so the Byzantines would have a stable friend and ally across the Black Sea to the north. Just to give you an image here of a map of what the Kyrian Rus would have looked like, we see in the south, just to the south there in the green, the Byzantine Empire at the time. But that whole blue realm of the Kyrian Rus, we see it includes what would be today the capitals of Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. So this is Moscow, Minsk, and Kiev. Today, if you go to Kiev, there is a beautiful church dedicated to St. Andrew, because it is believed that the Apostle Andrew actually passed through this area while he was making converts. And so when we look at the Kyrian Rus and we understand Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia, we see that all three have a common origin in a single state led by a single saint, Saint Vladimir. And so when we look at the conflict in Ukraine today, we should first and foremost see this historically in terms of a conflict that's sort of a conflict within a civilization, rather than merely seeing it as Russia versus the West, or Russia versus democracy. This is a civilizational battle taking place. Let's talk quick. We're gonna move over to this idea of the third Rome. We mentioned that Rome was the first Rome. Novus Roma, or Constantinople, the second Rome, and now we're going to see the emergence of the third Rome. Right? But to get to that, we have to talk about the emergence of a group called the Turks. Now, briefly, I want to say something about the Turks and the Mongols. These are both steppe nomadic peoples from Central Asia that migrated westward across the steppe lands. Almost think of it as a dry, grassy land that stretches like a medieval superhighway of sorts for people on horseback to ride east and west across from China in the Far East all the way into Europe and into what is today modern-day Turkey in the west. And so the Turks and the Mongols are two such peoples that head, the Mongols certainly head in every direction. They conquer China. They capture Baghdad. They'll even capture Moscow for quite some time. But the Turks are important because the Turks are one of these steppe nomadic peoples that migrates into the Islamic civilization, and they'll embrace Islam and then begin to form their own what would be called the Caliphate, the Ottoman Caliphate, the Ottoman Empire is what maybe most of us has heard of. But when the Mongols came into the Islamic world, they had they were able to quickly overwhelm the Islamic defenders, but the Turks, who were also a steppe nomadic people, were trained in the use of the tactics that the Mongols used, and the Turks through their conversion to Islam, ended up giving the Islamic world a new martial vigor that they had lost. Now, interestingly enough, what the Turks would do, being that they were at first a people that focused on riding on horseback, they generally didn't want to spread into the desert lands of the Middle East. So what we'll see is an emerging Turkish empire that really has a more northern focus. And in fact, they're going to turn their eyes across what is today Turkey, and they will move westward towards Constantinople and even into Europe itself. And in the year 1453, the Ottoman Turks were actually able to do what no army had been able to do before. They used gunpowder and some massive, particularly this massive cannon, to begin blowing holes in the walls of Constantinople, and were able to capture the city in the year 1453. Now, being that the Turks were in control of Constantinople, this gave them the ability to push further into Europe. They now had certainly a great logistical center, an important city that they're now bringing Islam and Sharia law to. As I mentioned earlier, the Hagia Sophia now has 4 minarets around it, and of course they renamed the city from Constantinople to Istanbul. But what I just want to mention here is that the Turks would move into what we call the Balkans, the southeastern Europe. Now, much of those lands the Turks would eventually lose, and we see that in many of these lands are majority Orthodox. We have a couple Catholic countries, but we do have a couple areas that we will still find a good chunk of Muslims. And of course, this mix of Catholic, Orthodox, and Muslim certainly makes this part of Europe a very divided part of Europe and a dangerous part of Europe in terms of wars breaking out. A good chunk of this was actually grouped into a country called Yugoslavia, but that country fell apart into multiple countries that we see today. I'm not going to go through all these countries in too much detail, but maybe I would just point out that dashed black arrow, the 2 dashed black arrows in the more to the top left are Catholic countries of Slovenia and Croatia. Our more bluish colored arrows, and there are more of these are the countries that are Orthodox. And amongst them, we have Romania, Bulgaria, Serbia, Montenegro, Greece, and North Macedonia. But I do have a couple of black arrows that are just straight black arrows. And these are our majority Muslim areas. And we see Albania as the one country that is majority Muslim. But Kosovo is a breakaway province of Serbia. We'll talk more about that shortly, where you will find many Muslims living there. And then that red arrow is Bosnia, and Bosnia is a terribly tricky country, terribly divided country, because in Bosnia we have a mix of Muslims, Orthodox, and Catholics, and because of that we see great division in Bosnia, and there's always been fear that the battles, wars could break out in this region once again. And at the end of this video, I'm going to point out some things that Russia could do to play a role in this heavily Orthodox part of Europe. All right, I want to mention here this idea that the idea of Moscow as the third Rome. That Moscow inherits in some sense the dynasty of the Byzantines, because the last of the Byzantine ruling family actually married into into Russia's royalty, and so we see that through this marriage that somehow there's a sort of a passing of the baton from Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire, now defunct, to Moscow and to Russia in the north. And so Russia would see itself as the third Rome, because we have the fall of Rome in 476. We have the fall of Novus Roma or Constantinople in 1453, about 1,000 years later. About 1,000 years later. And now we have Moscow as the third Rome. Now, Constantinople, despite it being the second Rome, and we see this passing to the third Rome, nevertheless, for Orthodox Christians, Constantinople and even the role of the Patriarch of Constantinople remained very, very strong within the Orthodox world. And there were long dreams of recapturing Constantinople for Christianity, and simply not simply in Russia. Of course, the Russians would have loved to have been able to restore the Hagia Sophia, to Christian worship. But it wasn't just an Eastern dream. Even in the West, we have Christopher Columbus, who was born in 1451, 2 years before the fall of Constantinople. He hoped that his voyages, that his discoveries could lead to enough wealth that would be able to lead a fleet and an army that could recapture Constantinople, because throughout his life, throughout the second half of the 15th century, there was a Christian dream, whether Catholic or Orthodox, to reclaim Constantinople for Christianity. And in fact, I would argue it's a dream that continues to this very day, and it's another thing we're going to talk about at the end of this video. All right, so because the Byzantine Empire has collapsed, and the baton has been passed to Moscow and to Rome, or into Russia as the Third Rome, Russia asserts itself as the protector of Christians, particularly in the Ottoman Empire and the Mideast, or in general, Christians who live within the Islamic world. This is a role that the Byzantines played, and the Russians believe that this is now their role to play. In fact, it was this role that actually led to a war called the Crimean War back in 1853 to 56, leading up actually just before the U.S. Civil War. Interestingly enough, Russia asserted that it would be the protector of Christians in the Balkans and in the Middle East. And you can see on the screen here, this map, the green area to the north, to the top of the map is the Russian Empire. And those green arrows, you can see that Russia was sending armies into the Balkans in order to protect the Christians from any persecutions that were taking place, led by the Ottoman Empire. Interestingly enough, the English and the French decided to ally with the Turks, and they sent fleets. You can see those blue and red arrows moving up to the Crimean Peninsula, because guess what? Crimea historically is Russian, and this whole history, especially of a blood-soaked Crimea, the blood of Russians who died on this peninsula, this passes down in history to the Russian people, and they have not forgotten it. Now, you and I might not know much about the Crimean War, but the Russians have never forgotten the Crimean War, and they've never forgotten the fact that when they asserted their role as protectors of Christians, that these Protestant and Catholic England and France move in to fight the Russians to keep them from being able to play that role as Christian protector. So again, we're seeing some roots of the conflict that we see to this day. At the same time, we're seeing a conflict within the church, because the Patriarch of Constantinople is still claiming a sort of spiritual leadership of the Orthodox world, whereas the Russians are now able to throw the argument to Constantinople, as Constantinople made the argument about the papacy in Rome, that if the leader of the church should be the leader where the emperor of Rome is found, then by all means the current leader of the church should be the Patriarch of Moscow. Now, I haven't seen too much of this play out between the Pope in Rome and the Patriarch of Moscow, but it certainly has been an issue of contention within the Orthodox world. So, just to mention briefly here, we can't go into the full history of Russia, but I do want to stress that there's because of a history of multiple invasions of Russia, the Russian people have become somewhat hardened and perhaps even somewhat cynical, and certainly a bit fearful of invasions in the future. Millions of Russians have died at the hands of invasions from both the East and the West, and even the South. Just to give you some examples, I already mentioned the Mongols coming in from, in this case, from the East, capturing all of the Kyrian Rus and Moscow included in their conquests. We have Turks that lived in the Crimean Peninsula, and a group of people called the Tartars, and they actually were able to strike northward from the Crimean Peninsula and capture and even, I believe, destroy Moscow. And of course, this became an important issue for Russia to claim Crimea for fear of an invasion from the south. We also have invasions from Poland. So the Poles, like the Mongols and those from the Crimea, they were also able to capture Moscow and rule the Russians for some time. Then, of course, we have the French. I guess I should also mention here the English, because the French and the English fought and defeated Russia in the Crimean War back in the 1850s. But if I actually rewind the clock back into the year 1812, we have Napoleon himself leading an army from France, marching all the way to and capturing, once again, Moscow. And finally, we have two world wars with Germany. The First World War actually ended with a German victory against the Russians, because the Russians were embroiled in a terrible revolution, as we'll see with communism. But then in World War II, all these lands that are historically Russia were again invaded in 1941 by the Germans, who came within some miles of capturing Moscow in December of 1941. Now, lastly, there was a different kind of invasion that took place, and I've already mentioned it here. In 1917, we saw the emergence of the Soviet Union, of the success of communism that took over Russia and conquered Russia from within. And as I mentioned earlier, communism is a Western ideology. And at this very day, I have a picture of Vladimir Putin. When he began the war in Ukraine, he gave a speech known as the Empire of Lies speech. And what he said is that Russia would not be conquered once again by Western ideology. And this new ideology, that we could call it the ideology of the sexual revolution, seeks to impose itself upon all the peoples of the world, whether they're Russian or Indian or China or Japanese. And he specifically said that this ideology is opposed to human nature, and Russia would not be conquered once again, whether from without by NATO moving its forces further towards Russia's borders, and it would also not allow itself to be conquered from within, as it was conquered from within by the Western ideology of Marxism. And so Russia is taking a stand against all these the new, what it sees as these new forms of invasions that are attacking its country, both militarily as well as ideologically. And of course, the Russians know their history. They're a very historically minded people, and they remember and recall, as I said, the millions of Russians that have died at the hands of both invasions, but also at the hands of these ideologies that have come into their country, such as the terrible ideology of communism. Here's a map of Russia in 1914. It gives you the border of Russia as it was just at the beginning of World War I. I mentioned earlier that, of course, in 1917, Russia would the empire would be overthrown, the czars destroyed, the royal family killed, and be replaced by the evils of Marxist communism. But what I want to point out here is that for the most part, Russia today matches many of these borders. But if you look to these red circles, in fact, you can see the word Ukraine there in the left part of the screen. We see that Ukraine, Belarus, and the countries today of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, they were all part of Russia. If you go just below Ukraine, we enter into a region called the Caucasus, where today we have the nations of Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan is actually a Shia Muslim country, whereas Georgia and Armenia are both Orthodox. Now, Armenia and Russia have long had a very strong relationship. Western Europe and the United States has actually moved into to Georgia in an attempt to bring Georgia into the sphere of the United States and Western Europe, or as I would call it, the Atheist West. And the reason why they've worked so hard on Georgia and not necessarily Armenia is because Georgia has direct borders on Russia. And the idea here is that if Georgia joined NATO, then NATO could station 100,000 troops on Russia's southern border. And of course, if Ukraine joined NATO, it could put another 100,000 troops on Russia's border. And this is why Russia will not allow Georgia or Ukraine to join NATO. Now, Georgia is refusing to participate in the sanctions on Russia that are going on now, in part, I suppose, for fear of reprisal, but also because they actually had a war with Russia in 2008 and have been trying to rebuild their relations with the Russians ever since. However, I see that in the news right now, they say that Georgia is actually trying to get into the European Union, which is a very interesting development. We'll have to see what happens. Azerbaijan was on the Caspian coast, and it's been seen as a perhaps alternative to Russia for natural gas for Europe. So if the Azeris could get their gas to Europe, then perhaps they could cut their supply from Russia. However, just before or just as the war started, Russia and Azerbaijan signed a treaty of alliance. So I somehow do not believe that Azerbaijan will be a source of energy for Western Europe. Now, the last big circle there circles much of Central Asia. And these are all majority Muslim countries. They are Sunni Muslim countries, and they are Turkic-speaking countries. And Turkey, which you can kind of see there next to those two smaller red circles, Turkey obviously speaks Turkish. It speaks a Turkish language, and Turkey's actually had its eye in this part of the world because they share a similar language and cultural history. Nevertheless, Russia has recently put down a Western-backed coup attempt in the largest of these Central Asian countries called Kazakhstan. And as a result, Kazakhstan is a stronger Russian ally today than I believe it has been in decades. I just want to point out that when people say that Putin is trying to rebuild the Soviet Union, it might be that he has more of an eye on rebuilding the historic Russian borders as they were in 1914. All right, so let's talk about what I could call the Western War on Russia. We see here the ideological conquest of Russia, which I've mentioned earlier here with this the invasion of this ideology of communism. Here's a picture of Karl Marx, who is you could maybe call the inventor of communism, the thinker who shaped this ideology, and Vladimir Lenin, who would actually unleash it upon Russia in 1917. So I just want to stress here that communism is not a Russian or even a Chinese ideology. It is a Western ideology. It was actually the second of three great Western atheistic ideologies that we've seen in recent history. The first was this idea of social Darwinism that led to the fascism that we saw particularly in Germany in the 1930s and 40s, and even in Japan during the same period. Also coming from the West is the terrible ideology of communism. And today, the last great Western atheistic ideology that seeks to overrun, and control the whole world is a sexual revolution based in we could maybe call the teachings of Freud. And so the United States and Western Europe, we've gone off the deep end in terms of the sexual revolution. And you know that it's getting out of control when we had originally we had the LGB community. Then it became the LGBT community. Then it became the LGBTQ community. Now it became the LGBTQIA community, and there are so many letters after that it is now known as the LGBTQIA plus community. That we are going off the deep end in terms of this sexual revolution, and it's hard to see whether or not or when this sort of the third great atheistic Western ideology will recede. But Russia today, I see, is playing a role in saying no to the spread of this ideology, and Pope Francis in some way agrees, as we're going to see in just a minute. I want to mention the British hate Russia. They hate Russia today, and they've hated Russia for so very long. They had a competition with each other in Central Asia as Russia attempted to gain a water port in an open ocean that didn't freeze every winter, and this led them into conflict into areas that we can talk about as Afghanistan and Pakistan today. As you might know, the British had a vast colony or a vast empire that included the colonial possessions of what is today India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and even into parts of Afghanistan. Interestingly enough, the British, I believe, actually helped Lenin sneak back into Russia in order to help him overthrow the czars, and unfortunately to the 1917 revolution, where communism took over Russia and began spreading itself across parts of Asia then and even into Eastern Europe. Now, when we talk about this, the problem of communism, of course, it's an atheistic ideology, just as social Darwinism is, as well as the sexual revolution today. But communism wages a war on Christianity, just as the sexual revolutionaries in the West do today. That we see, though, is certainly a direct assault on Christianity, persecuting Christians, sending them to the gulags, destroying thousands of Orthodox churches, particularly across Russia and in other parts of the Russian or the Orthodox world. What we'll see is that if we want to understand this idea of what communism was doing, it was opposed to both religion, as we see with Christianity, but it was certainly also opposed to the nation state. It wanted to create a global empire that destroyed the nation state and imposed its atheistic worldview on all people of the whole world. And so when we talk about the Cold War, we should really understand it as a battle of an atheistic Western ideology on one side versus an alliance of religious nations that work to oppose it. Now, one of the turning points in the Cold War, and there are many, but I just want to point out one, is this the turning of Mao's China away from the Soviet Union and reorienting it towards the United States and its allies. And this happened through the work of Kissinger and of President Nixon. And what happened when China turns towards the United States, you see all of a sudden that the Soviet Union has to worry about potential invasion from China in its eastern regions. And so this all of a sudden, this played a role in Russia's ultimate downfall, as it had to spend so much money to keep up its empire and, of course, keep up its military to be able to fight a war that could come on multiple fronts. Now today, of course, we oftentimes we talk about the pivot to Asia, that today we're worried about this rise of China. And so we've, many in the foreign policy establishment have argued that Russia needs to play the role that China played back during the Cold War, that we would want to flip Russia and orient Russia towards the U.S. and its allies, so that way we could put pressure on China. But what we've seen with Ukraine, instead of simply stating that Ukraine would not be part of NATO, instead of doing that, we picked a war with Russia, and now there's this great war in Ukraine, and all of the sanctions that they're placing on Russia now have driven Russia even more into the arms of China. And so if one is to argue, and I'm not necessarily one who argues that we should be seeking conflict with China, but if one was serious, and many, as I say, in the foreign policy establishment do see China as this great threat, well, if that's the case, then why were they unable to work a deal out with the Russians, not only about Ukraine, but in some sense, a deal to be as best friends with Russia as possible, so as to court Russia's relationship with the United States and its allies, and to bring it out of this relationship with China. And we've completely thrown that away. And this is actually the argument that Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri has put forward. He certainly doesn't like Russia, but from this letter I read of his not long ago, he certainly doesn't like China at all. And of course, he had issues with the going after Russia or having an issue with the Russians, because he certainly saw that if we are to pivot to China, if we are to pivot to the Pacific, then we can't be getting embroiled in some conflict in Ukraine, especially when the conflict in Ukraine did not need to happen. All Russia asked for was Ukrainian neutrality. That is it. If NATO, if the United States had simply said that Ukraine would be neutral and it would not join NATO, this would not be happening right now. But because it is, Russia is making more demands beyond simply Ukrainian neutrality. But that's a topic for another time. All right, so with the fall of the Soviet Union back in the late 80s, early 90s, what we see here are the thinkers who begin to believe that we've attained the end of history, that liberal democracy has won. So here's a very famous book which originated as an article by a scholar named Francis Fukuyama called The End of History and the Last Man, where he argued that with the fall of the Soviet Union, that the liberal democracy of Western Europe, the United States, and the white dominions of the British Empire, that they would now dominate the world, and that we would have this unipolar reality that would last as we simply spread democracy around the world, and not just democracy, but liberal values. Think radical feminism, the LGBTQIA plus community, critical race theory, that with the United States being the sole superpower, that all we would have to do, because we've proven through the victory in the Cold War that liberal democracy and liberal moral values, that those have won out. All we have to do is go around the world, topple governments, and impose democracy and liberal values around the world, and we would have the world brought into this new era, which of course is the end of history. Now, it turns out that this doesn't really work, of course, because as we've seen in Afghanistan and in Iraq or Libya, that and even in Serbia and the Yugoslavia, that toppling governments, butchering, perhaps inadvertently butchering civilians, creating refugee crises around the world, and then imposing not simply democracy, which we like democracy, but imposing these radical liberal ideologies, moral ideologies that Vladimir Putin says violate human nature. By imposing these upon traditional peoples, we're seeing now a revolt of these peoples, of these civilizations, of these religions, a revolt against the Atheist West and this very ideology and the great hubris that we saw in thinkers such as Francis Fukuyama. And by the way, I actually have a great deal of respect for Fukuyama. He's got some amazing books I'd recommend reading. I would, however, suggest skipping this one. So we had this ideological conquest of Russia with communism, and now we see an economic conquest of Russia. That in the 1990s, Russia was really taken advantage of by the West, and it was really quite pillaged and was very, very poor. I remember growing up back in the late 90s, that students at school would make jokes about just how poor Russia was and how it was a backwater part of the world. But what's worse, we had seen this ideological conquest of Russia with communism, but now we were seeing an ideological recolonization, which is kind of a term of what Pope Francis has talked about. He says to the countries of the world, he says, do not allow yourself to be colonized, to be recolonized by these Western ideologies. The West attempted to colonize the world through say empires like the British Empire, the French Empire. But then, of course, the ideological colonization of communism took place. But now this imposition of this Western moral values that are opposed to human nature, this is an attempt to recolonize the world. And whether it's Pope Francis or Vladimir Putin, both have said that they will not be recolonized. And this is another aspect of what took place during the 90s that Russia now is reacting against. Because not only was it taken advantage of economically, but the West began to attempt to import its own form, its own moral values that, as I said, are opposed to human nature. All right, now finally, we've seen the ideological conquest of Russia through communism, the economic conquest of Russia through what took place in the 1990s. But then in the 90s, we also see this military humiliation of Russia. Back in the late 90s, President Clinton got caught up in an affair with Monica Lewinsky, and in an effort to distract the country from this scandal that he would find himself dealing with an impeachment over, he decides to bomb a country. And unfortunately, this country is the historic ally of Russia, Serbia. The United States spends nearly 80 days bombing Serbia back into the Stone Age. Kosovo to the south, as I mentioned, was a Islamic part of Serbia. However, the region of Kosovo plays such a historic role in the origins of the Serbian state that for Serbia, Kosovo has to be Serbian. And there was this great war over the independence of Kosovo, which is somewhat reminiscent over what's taken place in the Donbass in eastern Ukraine. Russia has actually played off what took place here in Kosovo and Serbia in order to justify some of the things that we've seen take place in Georgia and Ukraine. But the point is that Russia was so weak in the 90s, it couldn't come to the defense of Serbia. It protested against what took place. And it did such political damage in Russia that Boris Yeltsin ended up having to resign at December 31st, 1999, because of the humiliation that he brought upon Russia in not standing up to this blatant aggression against Serbia on the part of the United States and its NATO allies. Again, NATO says it's a purely defensive alliance, and Russia has nothing to fear from it because it would never attack anyone who wasn't attacking a NATO country first. But Putin says tell that to Serbia, because in 1999 that's exactly what happened. It attacked Serbia, and it in some sense could not justify what it did. You might justify the protection of Kosovo, but it didn't simply protect Kosovo. It bombed the capital of Serbia, Belgrade, far to the north, bombed it into oblivion, bombed it so much that it even hit a Chinese embassy and killed Chinese nationals. And of course, the resignation of Boris Yeltsin in 1999 led to the installation of a new president of Russia on January 1st, 2000, and that man is Vladimir Putin. So here we see this silly war, silly unjustified war in Serbia. Not only is leading to some of the hostilities we see today, but it also brought about the rise of the leader that so many in the West are so hysteric about. The other thing I want to mention as far as military terms is the expansion of NATO. We see here, starting in the 90s, here in 1999, you can see the spread of NATO into Eastern Europe, and the biggest country there to look at is Poland. And so, remember back, I mentioned in 1996, Samuel Huntington put forward his whole idea of this clash of civilizations, and we see here he put out that idea 3 years before NATO began expanding. George Kennan, who was the one who created the idea of containment, to contain communism or to contain the Soviet Union, he looked at this expansion of NATO and he said this will be a disaster because if you advance NATO's borders towards Russia, Russia, being a historically minded people, will react to this. And you will come to a point where you will find yourself crossing a Russian red line and starting a war. And that is what we're seeing right now. And if we're not careful, it could start World War III. We could have, and I hope this doesn't happen, but there could be a nuclear exchange as the hysteria in Western Europe over Ukraine continues driving this whole narrative to such a point that I'm very afraid of there being a shooting war between Western Europe, the EU countries, NATO, and Russia, which could end in a nuclear exchange. And this is not what we want, and none of this should have happened. And this is why this is why Russia has said part of its demands to Europe is to roll back the borders of NATO back to as they were in, I believe, 1997. So all these countries, Poland, Bulgaria, Romania, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Croatia, all these countries, this whole idea of NATO infrastructure moving towards Russia, Russia wants that all brought back. Not because Russia wants to move in, but because Russia fears this the path of invasion that it has suffered so many times in its history. All right, so Russia, basically emerging under Vladimir Putin, we see that Russia has begun to embrace its history. In a sense, Russia is trying to understand itself beyond its communist past. It knows it can't go back to restoring Tsarist Russia or a Russian empire as it was in 1914. But what Russia is trying to do now is make its way in its democratic form, but to understand itself as its history and its culture and of course its religion. So because of this, Russia is embracing its Orthodox roots. It's rebuilding churches now that were destroyed by the communists. In fact, it's rebuilding churches at a rate that 3 new churches are opening in Russia every single day. So as you and I hear more and more about churches closing in the United States and Western Europe, Canada, Australia, that is not the case in Russia. Russia is building churches at a rate of 3 churches opening each day. In fact, Russia has built a monastery within the walls of the Kremlin. So right now in Moscow, there are monks and priests praying for the success of Russia in the conflict that we see right now, but also in its ambitions as far as the Russian nation goes. And so, in Russia, we see that the Atheist West cannot stand for a re-Christianized Russia, and so there is this drive to topple the regime in Moscow in order to bring a leader to rule Russia that will open Russia up to businessmen in Western Europe, the United States, that can pillage Russia of its resources, while also importing the sexual revolution into Russia in an effort to undermine Christianity and to import values that are opposed to human nature. And Russia is saying no to this. And unfortunately, Ukraine is becoming a kind of a proxy war between the Russia re-emerging as an Orthodox power, and of course the atheists in the West who want to destroy Christianity and destroy Russia. Now, Russia, of course, is promoting its morality. It's based in Christianity and the natural law. It's actually has put people in prison for attacking, not simply doing things that are purely immoral, but for doing things that are both immoral and assaults on Orthodox Christianity. There was a particular band who went into the great cathedral in Moscow, and I don't know if they were scantily clad or they got naked in the sanctuary around the altar doing rock music in the great holy church of Moscow. And of course, this band went to prison for that because Russia will not stand for any attacks on orthodoxy and on good Christian morals. Of course, the Patriarch of Moscow is playing an increasingly important role, as I mentioned earlier. If one considers Moscow as the third Rome, then the Patriarch of Moscow should certainly play a role in the Orthodox world. So again, with Russia embracing Christianity, it sees itself as a protector of Christians. If you wondered why Russia supported Assad in Syria, I know the news again would have us say that Assad is this brutal killer and he must be opposed and he must be removed from power. But what they don't tell you is that the reason why Assad has any power at all is because he's from a minority religious group within the Islamic world, and he has formed an alliance of minority religious groups that include Christians. And so if Assad was to fall, then you would have seen the wholesale slaughter of the Christians of Syria. And Russia, re-emerging now, and it's trying to find a path forward into the future while keeping one foot into its past and into its culture, its history, and its religion. It is reasserting itself as a protector of Christians, and that is why it got involved in Syria. Now, during that war, the Turks inadvertently shot down a Russian jet fighter. And when they spoke, the Turks and the Russians spoke about compensation or what could be done to mend the situation, Putin asked for one thing. He didn't get it, but he asked for one thing. He asked that the Hagia Sophia be restored to the Christians so that the Eastern Orthodox liturgy could be celebrated once more in the great jewel of the Orthodox world, the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, what is today Istanbul. Of course, that didn't happen, but it does point us to the reality that even still, Russia and the Orthodox world, they still look to the great Hagia Sophia, the great church of Constantinople, as the jewel of the Orthodox world, and really the dream of being able to restore Christianity to Constantinople and to that particular church. Now, we do see in the West attempting to seed divisions within the Orthodox world. Playing on that whole division between the Patriarch of Constantinople and the Patriarch of Moscow, there was a great push to divide these two from each other, and in effect to divide the Orthodox world itself. Now, several years ago, the Orthodox churches were going to hold their first ecumenical council, which is a gathering of all the bishops within their churches. It's the first time it happened in centuries, if it had ever happened at all since 1054. But that ecumenical council, it fell apart because of divisions being sowed, I think in part by the West, to divide. And the two men you can see here, the one with the white mitre on the right, that is the Patriarch of Moscow, dividing him from the Patriarch of Constantinople. And in fact, as everything broke out in Ukraine, not just in the last couple of weeks, but after everything started in 2014, the Patriarch of Constantinople intervened within the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine and approved of a split within the church in Ukraine so that there was a Ukrainian Russian Orthodox Church that used the Russian liturgy, but it was no longer in communion with the Patriarch of Moscow. This is a disaster. It's a travesty. But in part, I truly believe the Atheist West played some role in prodding the Patriarch of Constantinople to approve something that would be so divisive In fact, to this day, there is a schism within the Orthodox Church. There's the broader church, but there's even a schism within the Russian Orthodox Church between Ukrainian Russian Orthodox Christians who are in communion with the Patriarch of Moscow and with those Christians who are not. And it's a total disaster and it's a travesty. But we see that that within the Orthodox world, there are some great divisions, and I believe many of these divisions are being pushed by the atheists in the West. All right, so we have now war in Ukraine that just broke out. I'm not going to get into the details of that, but do check out some of my other videos. I have a map video that explains, at least up to this point, kind of what's been going on in the different fronts within the war in Ukraine. But I just want to focus here that Russia has been incredibly patient because for 7 years it's waited for Ukraine to carry out its agreements in what's called the Minsk Agreement of 2015. But instead of following through with what the Ukrainian government was supposed to do, it built up a massive army on the Donbass, the breakaway region in eastern Ukraine, with something like 100,000 troops ready to invade the Donbass. In just a week ago, we started seeing increased shelling in preparation for a full Ukrainian assault upon the Donbass. And Russia responded by first acknowledging the independence of the Donbass, just as we acknowledged the independence of Kosovo and Serbia. But then second, Putin, the Russians, told Ukraine that if the shelling continued, it would constitute a violation of Russia's red line and it would face war. And instead of ending the fire, I mean, in fact, if I was the Ukrainian president, I would have instructed my army to perhaps withdraw 20 miles or 30 miles away from the contact line, just to be sure that we didn't inadvertently start a war with Russia. But unfortunately, the Ukrainians continued the shelling, while President Zelensky went to a Munich security conference and announced that he would pursue obtaining nuclear weapons, which presumably he would use to attack Russia. And this was the moment that Russia decided that enough was enough, and it launched this war. And I just want to state here that you might hear in the media that Russia is somehow losing, that they're not moving fast enough. If you actually look at the ground and what's going on right now, Russia is clearly winning. The definition of winning, of course, is advancing. And every single day, Russia takes more territory and Ukraine loses territory. Reports out today indicate that the casualty ratio is 6-1. And by that, I mean Russia is suffering one death for every 6 Ukrainian soldiers' deaths. And so Russia is winning this war. And if you compare it to the Iraq War, it took the United States 2 or 3 weeks to reach Baghdad, and it took it 6 full days of hard fighting to capture the city. So what I think the Russians are doing right now is they are surrounding, encircling Kiev, and likely to encircle Kharkov, which is the second largest city in Ukraine, closer to Russia's border. But I believe that Russia plans to encircle these cities rather than try to fight a street battle. Meanwhile, they are in the process of completely eradicating the Ukrainian armies in the east, and those are the units that were stationed along the Donbass to invade and conquer the Donbass region. But now the best troops that Ukraine has are currently being encircled, and it's only a matter of time before Russia wins this war. So what are Russia's next moves? This is what I'm going to wrap us up with. I know I've gone a little bit over time here. I appreciate you all staying with me for this. And if you have any questions, leave them in the question section here. I do see one question I'll answer in just a minute, but I just want to wrap up just briefly here with what Russia could do. And I have a map here of Serbia and Kosovo, and something that the Russians could certainly do. And I'm not saying that they will do this. This is not a prediction. And I'm not even saying that if they did do this, it certainly wouldn't be tomorrow. But what the Russians could do is they could look for vengeance of sorts for the 1999 bombing of Belgrade by the United States and its NATO allies. And I've seen several videos emerge from Montenegro, which, if you look at the map here, it borders Kosovo, but also Serbia, or the greater part of Serbia. And the citizens of Montenegro have actually been marching, and they've been they're asking for Serbia to enter into and to take over Montenegro. And so the Orthodox Christians of Montenegro see themselves as, at least some of them, wanting to have some deeper ties to Serbia. Now, what Russia could do is that it could support a Serbian invasion of Kosovo, a reconquest of Kosovo. It could give it cover and support for a movement into Montenegro, but also next door in Bosnia, which you can see just up to the north of Montenegro, we've seen major moves amongst Bosnian Serbs, Orthodox Serbs in Bosnia, that are seeking a more independent role within Bosnia and perhaps could even reorient themselves, or rather a desire to reintegrate themselves into Serbia. So if Russia really wanted to do something that would thumb their nose at the Atheist West, once the whole situation in Ukraine is done, it could turn its eyes towards getting some kind of a justice and retribution for what took place in Serbia in 1999, which could lead to a whole conflict taking place there. But a conflict that where Russia might play a peripheral role, but certainly Russia now has the strength to help its historic ally that it didn't have in 1999. All right. The other aspect here is that currently Russia's great ally in the Middle East is Syria. It's fought for a long time here to help keep Assad in power. And Syria, I believe, was the first nation after Russia to recognize the independence of the Donbass region. And Russia has told Israel that this highland area that borders between Syria and Israel, which was part of Syria that the Israelis have been occupying, it's an area called the Golan Heights. Russia has told Russia has told Israel that the Golan Heights belong to Syria. And it could very well be that Russia could help the Syrians and support the Syrians in a conflict with Israel to reclaim the Golan Heights. The other thing here is a potential war alliance with the Greeks. So we've talked about the Serbs, we've talked about the Syrians, but another great historic ally, historically Orthodox nation, is the nation of Greece. Now, Greece has had its problems with the Turks. The Turks actually took over almost half of an island called Cyprus from the Greeks. And the Turks were never sanctioned for this blatant military invasion that could not be justified. There was no historical basis behind it other than the Turks wanted some more land in the Mediterranean. So, of course, the Greeks would love to have Cyprus back, but it makes me wonder. The Turks have really angered the Russians in Ukraine because the Turks have tried to... Erdogan, who is the leader of Turkey, he has this issue of almost playing both sides, where he's trying to be an ally to the Russians, but he's trying to be an ally to the Ukrainians. He's providing the Ukrainians with military drones that they can use against the Russians. And I think the Russians have had enough of Turkey. Turkey right now is approaching hyperinflation because of the botched fiscal policies of Erdogan. And I'd be interested to see if the Russians might support the Greeks in Cyprus. And who knows? Could the Orthodox dream of the Hagia Sophia that Vladimir Putin himself mentioned to the Turks as compensation for shooting down one of their jet fighters, could that be on the horizon? This would be the most difficult of all the things I've mentioned here, and the issue of course being that Turkey is part of NATO. So I don't necessarily see how a war with Turkey could break out. But I would be very interested to see if the Russians allied with the Greeks to retake Cyprus and to also boot Turkey out of Europe. Turkey's been trying to get into the Turkey's been trying to get into the European Union for many years, and part of its basis is that it holds a toehold in Europe. I'll show you the map here in just a second. But the idea here is that could Russia ally with the Greeks to take back the European landholdings of Turkey, and those landholdings would include the city of Constantinople and the Hagia Sophia. So could the Russians move in with the Greeks to reclaim what are known as the Turkish Straits? So then Russia has secure passage for its boats, its fleet, which the Turks are attempting to cut off right now because of the war. So Russia would gain this strategically important choke point of the Bosphorus, the Dardanelles, and the Sea of Marmara, while the Greeks would have control of what the European landholdings of the Turks. The Turks would no longer have any grounds for joining the European Union, while the Greeks also retook Cyprus. And lo and behold, guess what? The historic Syrian city called Antioch was conquered, like Cyprus, by the Turks. And if the Russians helped the Syrians reclaim the Golan Heights with Israel, perhaps they could help the Syrians retake Antioch from the Turks. Because right now, Turkey has armies within Syria holding a chunk of northwestern Syria, and I'm sure Syria would like some justice or retribution for this occupation by the Turks. As I said, I don't necessarily see any of this happening, but if Russia was to act within the context of its history, culture, and religion, I certainly see these as possibilities of what Russia could do. All right, I'm going to close out this live stream with just a quick look at a couple of maps that help sort of give us an idea of what I'm talking about here with these potential military actions that Russia could take should it play its role as a core state within an Orthodox Russian or Orthodox Slavic civilization. The first couple of maps here that I have for you helps give you a better idea of where the Golan Heights are located, and that is on this map here to the left. We see that area that is in between Israel on the left and Syria on the right. The Golan Heights originally belonged to Syria, but was lost to Israel following a war between the two nations. Now, as I mentioned, Russia has told Israel that these highlands belong to Syria, and if Russia was to form a stronger alliance with Syria, an alliance that would see Russia support a Syrian move into the Golan Heights, well, this would be quite a turn of events indeed. The Golan Heights, of course, border this the Sea of Galilee that you can see there, and that sort of that lake-looking object there on the just to the west of the southwest of the Golan Heights. I've actually been to this part of Israel, and if the Golan Heights went back to Syria, then the Syrians would control the entire east bank of the Sea of Galilee. And that, as I mentioned, they're called the Golan Heights because there are highlands there, which are strategically important, as they would certainly be a perfect defensive position for either Israel or Syria, whoever controls the heights. The other map that you see here on the screen is a map of Syria. If we zoomed out just a little bit, you can see these two red dash circled areas. The longer circled area to the bottom of Syria there, that is where we will find the Golan Heights, so that the Golan Heights can be found at that border of Syria and Israel at Syria's southwest. But if you go to Syria's northwest, you can see that that little chunk of Turkey that drops down into Syria, where Antioch or Antakya is located. And this is a historic Syrian city that the Turks came in and nabbed decades ago. And of course, I'm sure the Syrians would love to get that back. So the Turks, having antagonized the Russians during the Ukraine conflict, is it possible that Russia could support a Syrian move into Antioch while also supporting a move into the Golan Heights? It's possible. It certainly show that Syria means business in the region, and that it is retaking the areas lost not only in the war with the civil war, but also those lands that were lost in previous wars. And lastly, I'd just like to bring us back to the Balkans, where we see Serbia. So this map here at the top left, we can see Serbia in the middle with those three black arrows coming from Serbia, where Serbia could potentially play a role in this region, reclaiming Kosovo, and also moving into Montenegro and potentially Bosnia, where there are many Bosnian Serbs, Orthodox Serbs that are living there. And we actually just saw in just the last couple of days that Serbia has called up its reserves to prepare for any potential military engagement that could come. So I didn't expect this to happen anytime soon, but we're already seeing Serbia doing something by way of preparations. And honestly, I could certainly see Russia throwing NATO a curveball if it supported a resurgent Serbia, claiming justice for what was done to it back in the 1990s. And finally, this is the most unlikely of all the events here. I have a picture there, the bottom right of our screen, where I circle up Cyprus and the area where Istanbul or the old Constantinople is located, with the tiny foothold that Turkey has in Europe. I have those circled in red, but I also threw in there the circles for Antioch and the Golan Heights. This other portion is perhaps the far more unlikely portion of this potential resurgent Russia playing a role as a historic Orthodox Christian nation. But, if you wanted to go to the extreme, what could we see Russia do? Well, I don't see Russia moving into the lands of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, or invading Poland or anything like that. I would find, if Russia was to attack a NATO country, I actually think that it's much more likely we'd see something down here around Turkey. As I said, we could see the alliance with Syria moving into Antioch and the Golan Heights, while an alliance with Greece could see Russia supporting moves to knock Turkey out of Europe, retaking Constantinople, reestablishing the Hagia Sophia as the crown jewel of the Orthodox world, while also helping the Greeks reclaim the total island of Cyprus that the Turks had taken nearly half of the island from the Greeks. Now, will any of this happen? In all likelihood, perhaps none of it is going to happen. We have to see what happens in Ukraine first. But I just want to give you this sense that Russia sees itself as the core state of a Slavic Orthodox civilization, and if it can play that role, then return to its historic roots, then some of these moves I could see as certainly being a possibility. Well, that's all I have for you in this live stream, but I look forward to having you in a future live stream with me, as I usually have these Thursday nights at 7 p.m. Central Time. Would love to hear from you if you have any particular topics of interest. Right now, for me, of course, the Ukraine crisis, the Ukraine war, is something that's really got all of my attention. So I might be, continuing some coverage on this front, but I'm totally open to returning to some of the other topics that you might send my way. So feel free to let me know what topics you might like to hear in the future. Please feel free to leave a comment in the comment section below. Also, feel free to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with others. We're closing in on 200 subscribers, and I would love to see the channel grow even more, and with your help, that's certainly a great possibility. So thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day whenever you're watching this, and I will see you all next time.